Imagine for a moment that you're being violently tossed from side to side in complete darkness, breathing air so heavy and foul that your lungs seem to reject every breath. The stench of sweaty bodies, urine, feces, and rotting food blends into a nauseating symphony that seeps into your very bones. Now imagine that this is your home for months on end, perhaps years. This was the death reality show that millions of sailors faced for centuries in the cramped holds of ships that braved the oceans. But how the hell did they manage to sleep under such conditions? And more importantly, how did they maintain their sanity? The answer takes us on a fascinating journey through the darkest aspects of maritime exploration, where sleep was not merely a physiological need, but a matter of psychological survival. Because when you're trapped in a floating wooden coffin, surrounded by dozens of equally desperate men, sleep may be the only escape from the brutal reality around you. Let's start with the setting. Ships from the 16th to the 19th century were, in essence, floating prisons. The space allocated to the crew was calculated with the same generosity as airplane baggage space, that is, virtually none. An average sailor had about 6 feet in length by 2 feet in width to sleep. Stop and measure that on your floor right now. Done? That's exactly where a grown man was expected to spend 4 to 6 hours a day for the next several months or years. But here's the first mystery. Why only 4 to 6 hours? The answer lies in one of the most ingenious and cruel systems ever devised to maximize limited space, the hot bunking system. Picture this. You have 100 men on a vessel, but room for only 50 to sleep at the same time. The solution? Simple and diabolical. Half the crew worked while the other half slept, then they swapped. When you finished your 4-hour shift on deck, you went below and literally lay in a still warm, and often still damp, bed from the sweat of another man who had just gotten up to take your place. Now picture the scene. You descend a creaky wooden ladder, each step echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence of the hold. Your nostrils are immediately assaulted by a blend of odors that defy polite description. The air is so thick it feels liquid, saturated with ocean humidity, the vapor of dozens of breathing men, and the gases of decay that inevitably accumulate. When many people live in a confined space for too long, you grope around in the dark for your bed, a canvas stretched between 2 wooden beams, or, if you're lucky, a rope hammock. But here's a detail few know. Those hammocks weren't just about comfort or tradition. They were about survival. Why? Because ships weren't just cramped and filthy. They were constantly in motion. Waves of 15, 30, sometimes 50 feet would toss these wooden vessels like toys in the hands of an angry child. If you slept on a hard surface, you'd be literally hurled from one side to the other with every wave, racking up bruises and fractures that could mean certain death in a time without modern medicine. The hammock, swaying with the ship's movement, created a kind of natural suspension that absorbed some of the impact. Even so, sleeping in a hammock during a storm was like trying to rest inside a running washing machine. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating adaptations of the human mind, how a sailor's brain learned to completely shut off from the chaos around him. Because it wasn't just the motion that haunted their sleep. It was the noise. Imagine all the sounds a ship at sea produced, the constant creaking of timber under strain, the wind whistling through ropes and sails, the relentless pounding of waves against the hull, the shouts of sailors above deck, and, perhaps, worst of all, the intimate noises of 50 men trying to sleep in subhuman conditions. Snores, moans, hacking coughs from lungs rotted by salty humidity, the creaking of hammocks, whispered prayers or laments, and occasionally, something history books rarely mention, the sounds of men who had completely lost control of their bodily functions due to scurvy, dysentery, or sheer unrelenting terror. So how did they manage to sleep through all that? The answer lies in a peculiar trait of human nature, our incredible capacity for adaptation. The human brain, when subjected to extreme stress over prolonged periods, develops coping mechanisms that border on the supernatural. Veteran sailors developed what modern psychologists might call adaptive desensitization. Their brains literally learned to filter out sounds and sensations that didn't pose an immediate threat. The creaking of the ship? Normal. The shouts on deck during a routine maneuver? Ignore it. But the distinct crack of splintering wood or a scream of real panic, that would snap them awake instantly, no matter how deep their sleep. This ability to sleep with one eye open was so finely tuned that many sailors could fall asleep literally standing up, leaning against a wall during their few minutes of rest. It was a form of microsleep that allowed the body and mind to recover minimally without compromising the alertness needed to survive. But not everyone could adapt. And here we reach one of the darkest aspects of this story. What happened to those who couldn't sleep? Chronic sleep deprivation in a hostile environment led to a state sailors called sea fever, a condition that combined hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and violently erratic behavior. Men who had been shipmates for months suddenly saw each other as mortal enemies. Some leapt overboard in the night, convinced they were being chased by demons only they could see. Experienced captains learned to spot the signs: bloodshot, glazed eyes, uncontrollable tremors, constant murmuring to themselves, and most dangerous of all, the inability to distinguish dream from reality. When a sailor reached this point, he became a threat not just to himself but to the entire crew. The solution, not always humane, some captains simply ordered the afflicted sailor transferred to another ship during the night, a euphemism for being thrown overboard. Others used more creative methods, solitary confinement in even smaller holds or, in extreme cases, tying the sailor to the mast and leaving him at the mercy of the elements until he came to his senses or died. But there were also captains who understood the psychology behind the problem. These men developed a rudimentary system of what we might now call naval sleep hygiene. They realized that certain practices could help their men sleep better, thereby maintaining a more stable and efficient crew. One of these practices was the rum hour. It wasn't just a festive tradition, it was preventive medicine. Alcohol, consumed in calculated amounts, helped sailors relax enough to fall asleep despite the adverse conditions. But here's the trick: the quantity had to be exact. Too little and it had no effect. Too much and you had a crew of drunkards unable to work, or worse, prone to violence. Another interesting discovery was the power of storytelling. Astute captains realized that sailors who spent time telling each other stories before bed tended to experience more restorative sleep. Why? Because the stories created a kind of mental alternate reality that helped the mind disconnect from the horrific physical conditions of the present. These stories followed specific patterns: adventures in distant lands, buried treasure, beautiful women waiting at home, or heroic battles in which the sailors themselves were the protagonists. They functioned as a primitive form of cognitive therapy, allowing the mind to escape, even temporarily, from the wooden prison their bodies were confined to. But perhaps the most fascinating adaptation was physical. The human body, subjected to months of inadequate sleep under extreme conditions, began to change in ways that defy our modern understanding of physiology. Veteran sailors developed what could be described as sleep muscles, specific muscle tension that allowed them to stay in position in their hammocks even during the most violent storms. Their bodies learned to relax selectively. Some parts entered deep rest while others remained alert, ready to react instantly to any danger. Even more impressive, many developed a form of naturally segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping for 6 consecutive hours, they would sleep in 2-hour blocks, interspersed with moments of semi-consciousness. During these intermediate periods, they weren't fully awake, but were alert enough to monitor their surroundings. This sleep pattern, which we now know is closer to the natural pre-industrial human rhythm, allowed them to maintain constant vigilance without succumbing to total exhaustion. In essence, their bodies had figured out how to maximize rest within the brutal limitations imposed by life at sea. But don't think this adaptation came without cost. The long-term effects were devastating. Sailors who spent years in such conditions often developed chronic respiratory issues due to the terrible air quality below deck. Many suffered from severe arthritis caused by constant humidity and unnatural sleeping positions. More disturbing still were the permanent psychological effects. Many veteran sailors were never able to sleep in regular beds again after returning to land. The constant motion of the ship had become so integral to their sleep process that the stability of solid ground kept them awake for nights on end. Some bought hammocks and installed them in their homes, rocking them manually to simulate the movement of the sea. Others sought work in mills or factories, where the constant vibration of the machinery provided the familiar motion they needed to fall asleep. And then there were those who never managed to fully readapt. These men often returned to the sea, not for love of adventure or financial need, but simply because it was the only place where they could find enough peace to sleep. Now you might be asking, how do we know all this? How can we be sure that these conditions were really as extreme as described? The answer lies in the diaries and records that survived, hidden for centuries in dusty archives of maritime museums around the world. These documents, written by sailors, ship doctors, and occasionally more sensitive captains, paint a picture that is both fascinating and terrifying. A portrait of human experience pushed to its absolute limits. One particularly vivid account comes from an 18th century English naval surgeon who described the ship's lower deck as a circle of hell where men live like rats in a hole, breathing air that more resembles rotting soup and sleeping on mattresses soaked with their own excrement. Another diary, this one by a common French sailor, reads, "It's been 3 weeks since I last saw the sun. I go below deck when it rises and return only after it sets. My dreams are all of green fields and clean air, but I always wake up in the same nightmare. Sometimes I no longer know what's real." These accounts reveal something profound about human nature, our incredible capacity for both suffering and adaptation. Because as terrible as those conditions were, millions of men not only survived them, they built upon that experience some of the greatest adventures in human history. The same men who slept in conditions we'd now consider torture were responsible for mapping unknown oceans, discovering entire continents, and establishing trade routes that connected the world for the first time in history. There is something both heroic and tragic in that achievement, but perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire story is how it has changed our modern understanding of sleep and human adaptation. Recent studies by anthropologists and sleep psychologists reveal that many of the techniques intuitively developed by these sailors were, in fact, scientifically sound. Segmented sleep, for example, is being rediscovered as a potentially healthier form of rest for many people. The ability to fall asleep in loud, unstable environments is being studied to help modern soldiers and night shift workers. Even the practice of storytelling before bed, something many of us instinctively do with our children, may have its roots in those survival techniques developed in the damp, swaying hulls of ships centuries ago. And so we arrive at the end of this journey through the most intimate and unsettling aspects of historical maritime life. The next time you lie down in your comfortable bed in your quiet room, perhaps take a moment to remember those men who found ways to sleep while suspended over oceanic abysses, surrounded by darkness and the stench of human mortality. They taught us that sleep is not just a biological necessity, it is an act of faith. Faith that tomorrow will be better than today, that it's worth resting to face another day, no matter how brutal that day may be. And perhaps in the end, this is the most valuable lesson we can draw from these dark tales of the sea, that the human ability to find rest amidst chaos is not merely about physical survival, but about keeping hope alive in the face of absolute despair. Because if you can sleep in hell, maybe there's still a heaven waiting for you.